you can still find in some cities relics of our ancient countryside. This is a small piece of old oak wood marooned in industrial West London. Over thousands of years, these forests harboured a rich community of plants and animals. The felling of oak woods created a completely new landscape and quite new habitats for wildlife. With 19th century industrialism and the spread of towns, the forest retreated further, as if destroyed by a man-made volcano. A great deal of wildlife was wiped out, but the desert-like industrial landscape remarkably gave new opportunities to some plants and animals that you'd never find in oak woodland. There is, for example, the wonderful story of a plant which comes from the volcanic slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. It's called the Oxford ragwort, after the town where it was first introduced to Britain. Since a few plants were brought to Oxford nearly 300 years ago, it has spread along the railway lines and has travelled to many parts of Britain. The success of Oxford ragwort is a classic tale of the way in which plants and animals can thrive in the urban landscape. You know, most of the wild plants and animals which do well in the parks and gardens of our cities evolved thousands of years ago in woodland. In other words, to do well, they need trees. But the treeless wastelands of our cities provide an opportunity for a fascinating range of wildlife adapted to exploit really barren landscapes like this. And this is because there are a lot of natural wastelands like volcanoes and large beds of stones on which these species have actually evolved. Now, whenever we lay waste any part of the towns we live in, we begin an extraordinary process of colonisation by plants, then insects and other animals. And I saw the most amazing example of this as a boy in London just after the Blitz. Those terrible days of the Blitz laid waste hundreds of acres in the centre of London. It was a desolate scene, but within a few years the bomb sites were colonised by an amazing variety of wild plants. 250 species, including Oxford ragwort, in the City of London alone. In summer, a blaze of colour healed the wounds of the Blitz. Coltsfoot, which flowers in early March, was one of the first colonisers. Insects and birds followed the plants. Parties of goldfinches feeding on thistles appeared in the city. So too did the kestrel, hunting small birds on the bomb sites. But the first question, which fascinated many of us at the time, was how had the plants got there? How did this process of colonisation work? One of my favourite examples is this plant, Rose Bay Willow Herb. It's actually native to Britain, but was a rarity a century ago, growing in forest clearings. It favours ground which has been scorched by fire. It's also called fireweed. Insects pollinate its flowers. Then, when the pods burst, they release tens of thousands of seeds, which float on the breeze on parachutes of hairs. That's how rosebay and many other plants like coltsfoot got into town. The most successful species, like coltsfoot, filmed here over a few days, fly rapidly, taking advantage of the lack of competition from other plants. Now, this process of colonization did not begin or end with the Blitz. These same plants are still traveling around town. This is what remains of the once bustling Snow Hill railway station in Birmingham. Since the last train left this platform in the 1970s, plants have been arriving. They travel here in different ways, following a kind of natural timetable. Snow Hill, with its oxeye daisies, is now a favourite haunt of botanist Ian Truman.
The plants that colonise this sort of place tend to be plants which do produce very prolific amounts of seeds. And almost anyone can bring the seeds. I hate to think what seeds I brought. Botanists are very bad for this because they tend to go to interesting places and bring interesting plants to where they weren't in the first place. So people's feet, the wheels of cars, this used to be a car park for a time. The cars could have come from anywhere and they could have brought all sorts of seeds on the wheels. Birds bring seeds to a certain extent. They eat a lot of seeds. Their digestion isn't very efficient, and they come through like that. Well, here on the flagstones, or rather between the flagstones, we've got a nice little bit of variation in the vegetation, which is a sort of reflection of what we call succession, one plant coming after another. Right here in the very narrowest cracks, you might just about be able to see a little lichen. And the lichens manage to hold on to the little bit of water in the cracks. They build up enough material so that other plants can invade. And here we get the mosses coming in. And these build up more soil, a little bit more moisture is held, and then other plants start to come in. We can see the grasses in particular, Yorkshire fog, and herbs as well. This is the famous rose bay willow herb. But this succession goes all the way to forest practically, because we've actually got a tree coming in here. We've got the goat willow, which is another wind-borne seed. You might think of willows are growing in very wet places, but this one is very much at home in the dry places in the city areas. It's a pretty good tree, that. Tough cookie.
The process of succession takes place very rapidly, with new plants arriving all the time. As the plants get established, they are found by a range of creatures. Very soon, a derelict railway station bustles with new life. Now, it's partly a matter of chance which species turn up. That depends on what's around locally, and there's quite a lot of variation from one town to another. But particular plants do have a great attraction for certain kinds of insect. Rosebay willow herb in particular attracts this fantastic creature, the elephant hawk moth. You won't see the adult much. It's a night flyer, but you will see the caterpillars which feed on its leaves. Early colonizers like Rose Bay willowherb are eventually crowded out by new arrivals as wasteland begins to develop into woodland. Now, the kinds of shrubs and pioneer trees which come to dominate these wastelands varies, but in London and the south, there is one shrub which is amazingly successful. This is a buddleia thicket, growing on the site of London's old Broad Street station. Its native habitat is shingle beds in northeast China. Buddleia was brought to England less than a century ago, but it's spread incredibly fast in towns, growing in absolutely every nook and cranny. These thickets are not really very rich in wildlife, but they have one special quality. Buddleia flowers attract many insects, particularly butterflies. It's known as the butterfly bush. Sooner or later, buddleia thickets and their butterflies disappear as the developers' bulldozers move in. The nomadic plants and insects move on to begin the process of colonization again. However, even short-lived wastelands can provide a place in the city for some rare creatures. Listen to that. It's the song of a remarkable little bird, the black redstart. It's quite rare in Britain and first nested in central London on wartime bomb sites. It's still around, and though it's a garden bird in Europe, in England it only nests in industrial and very urban places. Old buildings seem to mimic its ancestral habitat of cliffs and gorges. It feeds on insects and will build its nest in very odd places, often the nooks and crannies of derelict buildings. Black redstarts breed in London, Birmingham, Ipswich and many other towns, moving their nest sites from year to year. However desolate a piece of waste ground, something will exploit it. This is the little ringed plover. Now, its natural breeding ground is gravelly riverbanks. Gravel pits and stony waste ground look very similar. This one is checking out a building site in East London. In fact, the London region is now a stronghold for this bird, with up to 40 breeding pairs. But perhaps the most exciting and spectacular bird, which moved into the city after the Blitz and now haunts the wastelands, is the kestrel. The kestrel is a small falcon which hunts over open ground. In country areas, it eats mostly small mammals like voles, but in towns, the kestrel's taken to catching sparrows, soaring and hovering among the tower blocks in pursuit of its prey. The kestrel is now well established in London and many other towns, surviving on a diet of small birds. It usually nests high up, often in tower blocks. These chicks, feeding on sparrows, have been raised in the heating and vent shaft of an office block in North London. They have a grandstand view over the town below. It won't be long before they're fledged and looking for a territory of their own in town. The man-made landscape has proved to be ideal for a bird adapted not to woodland, but to open country. You could say that so far the species that we've looked at, the kestrel, the black redstart and so on, are suited by their very evolutionary history to exploit the treeless wastes of our cities. Wastelands do have a very special interest and excitement for this reason. But there are other, even more remarkable ways in which an apparently hostile landscape can mimic the very special needs of quite sensitive animals and plants, quite different to those required by something like the Oxford ragwort. There is, for example, an amazing story of how the workings of our power stations, like Didcot over there, can provide a substitute of a natural habitat for one of our rarer and more exciting flowers. These are the rolling sand dunes called Formby Slacks on the Lancashire coast. The soil here is light and damp and rich in lime, which makes it ideal for several species of orchid. Now, orchids will only grow in these very special soil conditions. But by chance, they found a substitute habitat, miles inland from Formby, in what at first sight appears to be a much more hostile landscape. This is ash being tipped from the furnaces of Wigan Power Station. When it's first dumped, it's poisonous to plants. But as it weathers, it's colonized by a variety of species and begins to look like a man-made dune. Quite by chance, power stations have created a habitat for many plants which grow beneath the mountainous cooling towers. The special affinity between electricity and orchids has been studied by a team of botanists led by Ray Gemmell.
It does seem that orchids grow on quite a number of power station sites, but not all, and it depends on how old the ash is. Ash can be very different. Usually it leaches and weathers, but eventually most ash develops into a form which is good for plant growth, well, the growth of certain plants, particularly orchids. We're fairly certain they've arrived from orchid colonies on the dune slacks at Formby. Now, the prevailing westerly wind, it seems, has carried the seed here. Orchids produce immense numbers of very tiny seeds, produced like dust, carried by the wind many miles over land. The ash is very suitable for the orchid's growth requirements. It has a very light texture and it's not too fertile, so it's not good for the growth of weeded plants, but it is good for the growth of orchids and many other attractive plants.
The tale of the power station orchids is not the only example of wildlife popping up in very unlikely places. Here, on Brent Reservoir, close to Wembley Stadium in North London, there has been an equally remarkable story. This is a wonderful bed of Norfolk reed, the tallest grass in Britain, which is becoming rare in East Anglia. Peter Creasy, the Brent Wildlife Ranger, explains how the reed turned up here.
In the early 50s, one of these factories that you can see behind me let some effluent run out over the marsh, alkaline effluent, which means it had a lot of calcium in it. And for many years after that, nothing would grow in the area at all, no plants at all. Slowly, as the years went by, the effluent slowly became less alkaline, and the plants began to colonize the area. And all of a sudden, a small patch of this stuff, the reed, appeared, and just maintained itself as a small patch for quite a few years, until sometime in the early 60s, something happened. I don't know what, I don't think anybody knows what. It suddenly started to take off and explode, and now it's spreading itself all along the edge of the reservoir, which is wonderful as far as we're concerned, because there aren't very many large patches of this in this part of the world, and it's a superb habitat for wildlife.
You've now got this shy marshland bird, the reed warbler, nesting close to Wembley Stadium. Developments around the reservoir have improved it as a nature reserve in other ways. Building materials washed in from the Brent River have helped form a shallow estuary, a good hunting ground for herons and great-crested grebes. Nature conservationists have added their bit, providing artificial islands to attract this lovely bird, the common tern. These summer migrants from Africa now breed within sight and sound of Wembley Stadium. It's another great example of our cities providing a haven for quite specialised and sensitive wildlife.